This is Uncommonly Remarkable. We have surprisingly casual discussions about the lives and notable accomplishments of community leaders, entrepreneurs, and everyday folks like you and me. Think of this podcast as an opportunity to learn something new and to pick up on an entrepreneurial tip or two through open conversation. I'm Artis Beatty. I'm a doctor of optometry and the chief medical officer for My Eye Doctor OD. Though we will inevitably touch on topics within my area of expertise, the opinions and conversations held here are separate from my work with My Eye Doctor. Welcome to the show. Today's guest is John Munro, Qigong master, teacher, and founder of Long White Cloud Qigong. With hundreds of certified instructors worldwide, John is on a mission to make ancient wisdom accessible in the modern world. In this episode, we explore the history, power, and practicality of Qigong, from its deep roots in Chinese medicine and martial arts to its applications for stress, emotion, posture, and health span. Whether you've never heard of Qigong or have been curious about the energy-body connection, this conversation will open your mind and your body for something remarkable. Ladies, gentlemen, all you remarkable people, please welcome John to the show. John, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for spending some time with us today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
You know, I'm really excited to talk to you because we've spent a lot of time really thinking about health and wellness, fitness, health span, mental health, and all these things are really put together to help people understand ways that they can either better or improve themselves, live a healthier or longer life, ultimately increase that health span. And although we've touched on a lot of subjects, this is one that we have not touched on before, and I'm pretty excited for me to learn a lot about Qigong and to learn it from someone who's not only practiced for a very long time, but has actually trained others is really, really kind of cool for me. So why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you?
Yeah, sure. Look, I love the focus on health span. I think that's such a healthy way to be looking at things, and I think Qigong, fits right in with this very much. So anyway, about me, my focus on Qigong has been for pretty much my entire adult life. My first introduction to it was actually when I was quite a bit younger. I had a lot of different health issues growing up, and some of them were quite serious. The main ones were particularly affecting my lungs. I had asthma and pneumonia and bronchitis, and I'd go into hospital with collapsed lungs and things like that. And that was just an ongoing thing for me as a child. And my mother wanted to get me healthy, and the Western medical system wasn't making a lot of progress. So she went and studied to become a naturopath. To find different natural ways that she could use to help me with my health. And she did then go on to have a successful practice as a naturopath, so it wasn't all about me, but that was a big part of her motivation to, pursue that course. And when she was at naturopathic college, they had their core subjects, things with, nutrition and anatomy and physiology, all these sorts of things. But they also had a lot of guest lecturers come in and teach them just a little bit about a variety of different areas of knowledge and practices, so that when they went out and were working with clients, they would have an understanding of some of what was available that might be useful for the people they worked with. And one person they had come in taught them some Qigong. And it was just a little bit, just a tiny bit of Qigong. But she thought it was pretty interesting. So she then came home and showed all of her children, me being one of them. And I was probably about 10 years old at the time. And I thought that was fascinating. Being able to feel my own energy and work with it is a little bit like being a Jedi, as a young child. and so that really was a formative experience for me. I continued to play with, again, it was just a few very simple exercises. I played with them as I grew up through my teenage years. And then it was as a young adult, I came into contact with the same person who had taught her just that little bit when she was studying in college. And I asked him if he was still teaching Qigong, and more specifically, would he teach me? And he said, yes, he would teach me, but I had to study Chinese medicine as well. So it was very hard to find Qigong back then. There weren't a lot of classes you could just show up somewhere. It was like very hard to find, and so yeah, it was a bigger commitment than you might expect. But I was so fascinated by it that I said, "Yep, okay." And so I signed up to study Chinese medicine and Qigong, and from there that developed. And I worked in my own clinical practice for a period of time, and then I got involved with Kung Fu, connected with the Qigong, and then more and more into the Qigong teaching. So I guess before I mean that's a broad overview of my
Yeah.
background with that. I guess before we go too far, it's probably helpful to let people know what Qigong is, though, because it's like all the stuff with
Ab-
Qigong. Um,
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, that was going to be what I asked you next,
yeah,
but I was going to get sidetracked, by the way, because I wanted to also understand the connection between the Chinese medicine and
yeah,
Qigong, and how and why it was important for you to do those two things together,
sure,
because I assumed there was a reason that he wanted you to learn Chinese medicine
yeah.
in the process.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I can explain all that together. Um, so to begin with, in very simple terms, Qigong, it's one word, but it's made up of two words, Qi and Gong. Now, in this day and age, a lot of people have actually heard the word Qi. It's become,
Hmm.
into our popular awareness, people know that Qi means energy. It's not, too uncommon for people to understand that. The Gong part is generally not so familiar to people. Gong means work or skill. So Qigong is actually a really broad term that refers to all of the practices and all of the principles behind working with our energy and developing skill with our energy.
Mm.
Now, there's lots and lots of different ways that we can do that, and because of this, there's lots of different Qigong practices. And actually, if you look at cultures all around the world, they've pretty much all had their own type of qigong in a way, ways of working with their energy. They didn't call it qigong, right? Because they had a different background. But every culture has had aspects of this. In China, they called it qigong, and they developed a very rich, intricate understanding of how our energy works within us. And from that came three main ways that it was applied historically. So the first of those was to health and well-being. And part of this was doing exercises and practices just to make ourselves well. But another part of that was when you had enough understanding of the energy, you could use that as a direct way to affect other people and their energy to bring health. So as a direct healing treatment. The second major application was to martial arts. What can heal can also hurt.
Mm.
And so within the martial arts, again, there were a couple of sides to this. Part of it was developing your own capacity, your own strength, resilience, sensitivity, and so on, so that you could just be functioning at your highest level yourself. And the other was this aspect of, well, if you really know how to work with the energy, you can also use it to affect your opponent in detrimental ways.
I see.
And
Yeah.
then the third historic application was to spirituality in different ways. A number of different religions and spiritual groups. Because to work with our energy, it's a relatively subtle thing and it requires really tuning in. It requires understanding ourselves better at what can become quite a deep level. And not only that, as we get deeper into it, it develops a greater understanding of our connection with other people and with the world around us as well. And so this ability to develop this greater understanding of self and our connection with the world around us fit very well within what different spiritual or religious groups were aiming to achieve. So it's important to understand that qigong is not a martial art. This is one of the misconceptions.
Mm.
People go, oh, qigong, it's a martial art. No, it's not a martial art, but it's these principles of understanding how we work with our energy that we could apply to martial arts, as we can also apply it to other things as well. Equally, another common misconception is that qigong is a religion. It's not a religion. Again, it's principles and practices for working with our energy. It just so happens that several religious or spiritual groups have found that that's really useful for developing that sensitivity and understanding and so on. But Qigong itself is just this principle of working with our energy. So why did he want me to learn Chinese medicine? Again, it's because there is this deep connection between Qigong and Chinese medicine. All of Chinese medicine, in fact, is based on understanding how our energy flows.
Mm.
Now, they work with that energy flow in a variety of different ways. It can be using acupuncture, so inserting needles as a way to affect the energy flow. It can be using physical massage. It can be using herbs and understanding how those herbs affect the energy flow within us. Or the very direct way to work with that energy is through Qigong, using practices that we do ourselves to affect our energy. So to extend that a little bit more into, okay, so what is this Qigong? I've talked a lot about it and maybe like quite, general terms, but like, what does it actually look like? Again, there's lots and lots of different practices that fit under this category of Qigong. The most common ones involve using our mind, our body, and our breath together. So
Okay.
there's different ways that can come together as well, because sometimes the mind aspect, it can be sitting in meditation, right? That's one way we work with our mind. The breath, it can be just specific breathing practices. The body, it can be specific postures and things like that. Most commonly, all of them come together. And so we're doing movements or holding our body within different postures. We're using our breath sometimes we're just regulating our breath to make it calm. Sometimes we're using it in very specific ways. And with this, we're using our mind to connect to what's going on within us so that we can start to become aware of what's going on with the energy. And as we develop skill, actually start to lead and guide that so it flows in a more healthy way.
So now as you're starting to describe the practice, so a couple of things come to mind. So can you talk a little bit then about the differences between Qigong and maybe Tai Chi, which
Mm-hmm.
people may be more familiar with,
Yeah.
versus, and when you talk about movement or poses, we also think yoga. So
Yeah.
if you had to kind of
Mm-hmm.
create me a chart with these three things, like
Yeah.
where are the differences and where are the similarities?
Yeah, absolutely. Because there is a lot of similarity between all of those things. In many ways, I think a good way to describe Qigong is perhaps as the mother of a whole lot of other arts or practices. In that,
Mm.
again, Qigong as a term, it describes all these different ways of working with our energy. And as such, Chinese medicine is part of Qigong in a way. It gets into some stuff that's outside of what we would normally think of as Qigong practice, but it's developing skill. All the type aspects of Chinese medicine is ways of affecting our energy. Kung Fu, so all of the Chinese martial arts actually stem from Qigong. Now, within that, some of them aren't focusing very much on the energy, at least to begin with. They're just like, getting your muscles strong and things like that. But
Mm.
ultimately, because it's based on Chinese philosophy and understanding of energy, ultimately at some point it gets to this point of like, well, what we really want here is to understand what's going on with your energy and work with that. Tai Chi, when people say Tai Chi, they're normally referring to Tai Chi Chuan. So,
Mm.
but it gets shortened to Tai Chi. So that Chuan bit at the end means fist. So it's Tai Chi fist. Fist means it's a martial art. So Tai Chi Chuan is a martial art that uses principles of Tai Chi. Tai Chi is the harmonious interaction between the polarity of yin and yang.
Mm.
Okay, little bit, getting into terminology here. But basically, within that martial art, they use many Qigong principles to develop the power and the effectiveness of their martial art. So you could say that Tai Chi is a type of Qigong. It's one application of this understanding of how to work with our energy.
I
But
see.
equally, other martial arts also use Qigong. They use them in some different ways. Chinese medicine uses Qigong. It uses it in some different ways. But they're all working with this fundamental understanding of our energy and how it flows and what we can do to affect that. So to tie that, so yes, just sticking with Tai Chi for a moment, a lot of Qigong practices, to someone who doesn't really know much about each of them, a lot of Qigong
Hmm.
practices will look a bit like Tai Chi, you know?
Oh.
And in fact, when a lot of people, when they do Tai Chi, the reason they're doing it is because it's a type of Qigong.
I
Because
see.
what they're really wanting to get out of it is the stimulation of the flow of their energy and making it balanced and harmonious. Most people doing Tai Chi Chuan today aren't doing it to use it as a martial art. They're doing it to get their energy flowing in a healthy way. So they're doing it because it's Qigong. It's just a particular type of Qigong. So now the connection to yoga, because again, yoga has a lot of similarities to Qigong as well, because they're working with energy too. They call it prana instead of Qi. So that's the Indian term, prana. Their focus on energy is a bit different, because
Mm-hmm.
historically it's developed in a different way. But there's so many connections. Qigong, we work with mind, body, breath. Yoga, they work with mind, body, breath, right? Yoga is yoking together. It's yoking these different things together, so they work well together. There's a focus on energy to some degree, although I think Qigong focuses much more directly and specifically on energy. That awareness of energy is inherent within Qigong. A way I like to describe both the similarity and the difference between yoga and Qigong is Indian food and Chinese food.
Hmm.
If you think about, okay, if you think of Indian food and Chinese food, there are principles of how they put their food together, how they combine ingredients and flavors, and the purpose of why they combine things together in that way is one, because they want to make it taste good, right? And two, because ultimately they want to use that food to make them healthy. But yet, they're quite different from each other. They've got a similar motivation behind them, similar principles in many ways, but Indian food and Chinese food is quite different. And that's the same between yoga and Qigong. There's a lot of underlying principles that are very, very similar or even the same, but the way that they've developed is quite different. And so they look different, they taste different effectively.
Yeah.
But there's many of the same purposes. And some people prefer Indian food, some people prefer Chinese food, some people like them both. And that's, I think, the
Yeah.
same. Some people will go, actually, I really like my yoga. Great, awesome. Other people are like, well, I actually prefer Qigong. Great. Some people are like, I like some yoga and I like some Qigong. Awesome. You can get what you need from each of those practices and traditions.
It's funny that you describe it as Chinese versus Indian food because in my mind, as you were going through those differences, I started to think in a very American way the difference between whiskey and bourbon, right? Because all bourbon is whiskey, but not all whiskey is bourbon, and so you
Yeah,
kind of so it's very similar. It's a much more simplistic way to think about it, but it really is one of those things where the category is set and things are part of the category,
yeah.
but there's kind of the mothership that kind of bred it all.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And between the cultures, it's like, I mean, did yoga come from qigong? No, because culturally they had their different roots. But there's so much similarity that we see, between them from each of those cultures.
Well, that actually brings another thought, though, because when you're thinking about disparate cultures and development of similar types of thoughts, there's some root that people were either exposed to or trying to solve for, and
Mm,
so with the development of qigong, like, can you talk a little bit about maybe some of the impetus, like how did it get started,
yeah.
and what was really it's solving for?
Sure. Yeah. Well, because again, this is where there's some interesting comparison between yoga and qigong. I'll stick with the qigong to begin with. Maybe we can talk about how that's different from yoga as well. Um, so qigong is so ancient that we don't know where it first came from. We can't go back and go, oh, this person invented qigong at some point. It's like, no, no, no. It goes way, way back. So what we have though is we have bits and pieces of archaeological evidence going back, some of which goes back as far as 8,000 years, or, well, carbon dating and all that. It's like between 5 and 8,000 years. So they don't know exactly, but there's like some pieces
Wow.
of pottery that show people doing stuff that looks like they're doing qigong. So it's like, oh wow, they've been doing this for a long time. But then there are written references. And again, one of the things with the Chinese is they were pretty good at keeping written records of things from quite an early age. And some of those written records go back as far as like 4,000 years. So, and then there've been lots of
Wow.
different references here and there through different
Hmm.
documents as we've gone forward. So we don't know exactly where it came from, but we do have some understanding of how it evolved and developed over time. And we do have stories about where it may have come from. And so some of those stories about the origins of Qigong go back to the Neolithic period where people were living very simple lives. They were hunter-gatherers sort of thing. And back at that stage, the common people, they would work hard all day in the fields and they'd go out and do their thing. And for them, as agriculture was starting, for them to go work hard in the fields was to go and work in the rice paddies, which meant you got really tired and you were wet. And then you came home tired and wet. It started to get cold. Guess what? They had all sorts of issues with aches and pains in their joints and their body, and also other illnesses that came from that. And what they discovered was that if they came home and just were too tired and rested, they had major issues with these, illnesses, aches and pains and so on. If instead of that, they came home and they danced first before they rested, a lot of the issues weren't as bad, and in fact it helped them to recover from many of these issues and illnesses. Now, of course, the way that they danced back then, it was different dances, like shamanic dances, effectively copying animals, copying different things in nature. That was their type of dancing. And so as they observed this process, and it was, hey, dancing is really good for our health, we should keep doing this sort of thing, they started to, or some among them started to notice more specifically, like, hey, when we dance like this, it helps with this kind of problem. When I dance like this, when I copy this animal, it helps me with something else. And so little by little, their understanding became more and more refined until it got down to specific movements. How does the energy actually flow through our body along pathways, which we call meridians? But it started from those early roots of dancing in different ways. It moves my body, literally it moves my energy. And as a result of that, it helps me in different ways. And so right through till today, Qigong still carries the traces of those Neolithic roots, where so many Qigong movements are based on animals or trees or mountains, because that's where it all came from in the first place. And it's more than that, really. It's definitely the connection to that early shamanic dancing, but it's also the whole philosophy that developed around that of understanding our connection to nature, understanding the patterns of how things work within nature, and then understanding how those same patterns work within ourselves. And so that symbolism of nature is still very much embedded within many of the Qigong practices.
That's pretty amazing. And when you think about people looking for ways to solve problems. I mean, we've been solving problems as humans for a very, very long time. And although our stressors are different, we've always had stressors that needed to be addressed. And so I would imagine then that there are practical modern applications for Qigong for people. Can you help us think a little bit about how you apply Qigong to the modern world and why it could be helpful for people to think about?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a good way to at least begin to talk about this is actually in connection to those ancient applications and see how those carry through to today. Because it's very easy when we think about the way they applied it anciently, and you start imagining someone dressed in funny robes sitting on a mountain, doing their things that was back then, right? But if we dig to what was the root of what they were trying to do, we find that actually those things are still very relevant today. So again, the first of those applications was simply to health and well-being. Now, again, those people working hard in the field and getting stiff and sore and having illnesses, okay, we might not be out working in the rice paddies, but we're doing other things that get our bodies stiff and sore and lead to us having illnesses, right? Big one being we sit at computers way too much today, or sit at our desk in one form or another. Or we have these other things, and understanding how to move our body so that the energy flows freely can do so much to help to remedy this and bring health and well-being. So that's just as relevant today as it was then. It's just, we've got some different stresses on us, but the root thing of making ourselves healthy by moving our body, working with our breath, that's pretty relevant. If we look at the application of martial arts and kung fu, now, I don't know, maybe a lot of us would think it'd be cool to be some kung fu master leaping through the bamboo forest or something. I don't know, but that's more of a fantasy sort of thing, in this day and age. And certainly, hopefully, most of us hope that we never ever have to fight anyone in hand-to-hand combat, right? But
Exactly. Although you had me at Jedi earlier, but
yeah. It's a cool fantasy thing. But in terms of practicality, who wants to actually fight people? I don't know. I mean, maybe sometimes when people are young and they're like, maybe it's competitive sport, if that's something, fair enough. But in terms of day-to-day life, no, that's not something we want to have to do. But if we look at, okay, but what's the root of what we're doing in that type of application? Where in that application, we're moving beyond just health to high performance. And
hmm
that's high performance of both body and mind. The ability to have focus, that sharp focus that's required. When you're in life or death combat, you need to get focused. But
focused,
that
yeah.
same focus can be so valuable to us in addressing any of the different things that we're wanting to achieve in our life. And so many of the practices that develop that focus, that physical resilience, that high performance, carries through to today as well. Again, whether you're an athlete who wants an edge in your athletic pursuits, or whether you're a business person who's wanting to be able to be sharper and more focused as they, are dealing with decisions and situations they have to deal with. The different practices are so relevant to that. And then the third application being the spiritual or the philosophical. Again, we can think like,
Mm.
okay, Taoist priests, Buddhist monks, that sort of thing. But at the root, it's like, and some people are interested in those things in today's day and age. But it doesn't have to have that particular cultural context to it to be
hmm
relevant to us. That ability to understand ourselves better, to understand how we connect with the patterns of nature around us, that can help us to just live in a way where we feel more at peace, more harmonious with the different processes and phases that we go through in our life. So again, I think equally relevant today, just applied to our modern context.
Well, and I would think that being able to understand um, energy centers and kind of be able to understand just in general your personal relationship with others, the environment, and with yourself has implications for other things. So, I've talked to people a little bit about addiction and how their Eastern practices are often used to help people break addiction because of the awareness that they can create. And I would imagine now that I'm understanding the umbrella and kind of the mothership, that this would be one of those things where it could be practical for that perspective, from that perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. This is one of the things that I think really, when you sum it all up, can be so valuable about a practice such as Qigong. Because there are these very direct things like, okay, maybe you've got a specific health issue. There are practices that you can do to help you with that specific health issue and things like that. But when you put it all into the big picture, I think one of the most valuable things is the awareness and understanding of yourself that you can develop.
Mm-hmm.
And that then flows into absolutely everything. So recently, just last year, I had, it's kind of a series of experiences that I thought was quite interesting that ties in with this. So I'll tell you a little bit of a story, I guess,
Okay.
relating to this. So during, prior to COVID and all of the lockdowns and everything that happened with that, I used to travel quite a lot teaching Qigong in different countries around the world. I would go and I'd teach workshops and run retreats and things like this in different places. But so I'm originally from New Zealand, and so basically I got stuck in New Zealand during all of that time, and the lockdowns
Mm.
were very strict, and we had restrictions on the border and that sort of thing. And as a result of that, I was basically stuck in New Zealand for 2 years. And then after that, because I was busy with things in New Zealand, it took another 2 years for me to tidy up all of the things from being there. So basically, for 4 years, I didn't really travel anywhere. I was just in New Zealand. And that was an unusual period of time for me. Last year was then the first year that I really started to get out, and I got
Mm-hmm.
out and taught some workshops different places and ran some retreats and attended a big conference and that sort of thing. First time in a long time. So because of this, as I was traveling around, I came into contact with quite a few people who had known me only online up until that point. They had
Mm-hmm.
learnt Qigong practices from me through online teaching, which is a great way to learn, by the way. And sometimes people think, oh, hey, you could only possibly learn that in person. It's like, well, technology is pretty darn good these days. Maybe you go back 20
Yeah.
years ago and maybe that would have been really hard, but nowadays you can learn very effectively online. Anyway, so a lot of people I came into contact with, and they'd had contact with me online, and they'd learned, and this had been over a number of years, and so during that time they'd really practiced Qigong quite a lot, and they'd developed quite a lot within their practice, but this was their first opportunity to see me in person. And so as I met each of these people in person, naturally as we were chatting, they would talk about their experience with Qigong because they wanted to tell me about the impact it had had on them. And each time, it was so remarkable, this really stood out to me. And in conversation after conversation, I heard people say the exact same words. They would say, Qigong has been life-changing for me. And then I'd be talking to someone, and they would say how it was life-changing for them, right? And then someone
Yeah.
else would say, Qigong has been, and they'd specifically say, life-changing. And then someone else would say, it's been life-changing. And so I'm hearing all of these stories, and this is wonderful. It's really nice to hear the impact that it's had on people. But as I was
Right.
listening to these stories, after a while, as I kept on hearing this, I thought, you know what, this is really cool, but I'm probably not the person who will get the most value from hearing these stories
Mm.
because I
Mm-hmm.
already know
You
how
know.
valuable Qigong can be, right? And so
Yeah.
from this gave me some inspiration to reach out to my community. And basically, we just sent an email out and said, hey, I've been hearing all these stories. If Qigong has been life changing for you, would you like to share your story? We'll put it together into a book. And so that's what we did. And so over the space of just a few months, we had a whole lot of people send in stories of how Qigong had been life-changing for them, and we compiled it into a book so that we could make it available. Some other people could hear these stories. And there were so many different stories of how Qigong had been life-changing. And some of the ones that really stood out to me were actually people who Qigong had really helped them with addiction, just from what you were saying before. And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it's not one of the things that you might immediately, come straight away to the front of your mind, but it's like, for some people, that was really, really big. For other people, they had, a range of other things, from specific health issues that had helped them with, to just helping them feel more settled and calm in their life, to changing the course of their life, giving them a new purpose, to
That's
things
amazing.
like having more self-confidence, just a whole range of different ways. So a whole lot of different people with different needs, and Qigong helped them in all these different ways. So, and a lot of this, again, that comes back to, yes, you can use Qigong for specific this or that different issue that you have. But overall, that awareness of yourself and that taking the time is, of course, using a good method as well, but taking time to nurture and care for yourself to bring balance and harmony just can flow out into so many good positive effects.
It's really interesting to hear that people were using very similar language about the result, right? But one of the things that I've now started to piece together after having the ability to have conversations with a lot of people is that
Mm-hmm.
there are lots of elements that kind of touch, and the more conversations I have, the more I'm able to kind of pull these things together in my mind. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and and so we talked about maybe the awareness, and one of the things that people are often not really aware of is emotion.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had a conversation not very long ago around the way emotions physically affect the body.
Mm-hmm.
And we often think of emotions as thoughts, right? Like we
Mm-hmm.
have this thought that maybe
Yeah.
we're afraid or maybe we're angry, and it's a thought. And that thought is what drives maybe what happens physiologically. And the concept that the physiologic response is probably the bigger response, and the thought is there, but it's not really the driver, is really interesting. And, I think when we think about Qigong, I think there's really some awareness that's brought about around emotion and the body's response to emotion that is important. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. As you've just described, I think this is one of the biggest misconceptions people have about their emotional well-being is when they think, oh, emotions, they're in my head. It's like, no, those are thoughts. We have a different word for that. Emotions occur inside your body. Now, your thoughts play an important role because what your emotions are is your physiological response to the situation around you. Now, part
Mm-hmm.
of that is how are you thinking about the situation around you, but a big part of it is also how is the situation around you. But the actual response is occurring internally. Chinese medicine and connected to that Qigong offers some really useful insights about this. Because within Chinese medicine and Qigong, we recognize the connection between different emotions and the functions of different organs. Because
Mm.
when we have that emotional response, our body activates in different ways to deal with whether it's really there or we perceive it's there in some way, to deal with what's going on in our environment around us. So if we have a fear response, for example, there's a whole chain reaction of things that happen. But one of the big things is we release adrenaline.
Mm-hmm.
So our adrenal glands sit right on top of our kidney. So if my fist was my kidney, the adrenal gland is like right on top of it. So when our body sends a big stimulus to the adrenal glands, the kidneys get activated as well. And if you think about a strong fear response, I hope you don't mind getting into a bit of detail here. I think it's
No,
really
no, I
helpful
think
for
this is great.
I think it's
Yeah.
helpful for people to understand just how strongly the emotions are connected to real physical experiences inside us and how our organs function and so on. So when our body sends a strong nerve signal to the adrenal glands, it stimulates the kidneys at the same time. Now, if you think of a really strong fear response, what's one thing that people sometimes do if they're extremely, extremely fearful? They urinate.
They, yeah,
That you think someone's so scared they wet themselves, right? And
yeah.
it's a physical thing. The adrenal glands, kidneys, too much, and it goes down. Now, that then ties into our posture because it's not just the kidneys that get affected. What happens is the kidneys get stimulated, it squeezes the kidneys, and that sends a squeeze of energy right up the spinal cord. And if you think about that in terms of a fear response, this is useful, right? Because boom, burst of energy up the spinal cord, the pupils dilate. We're like, this is useful for us. That's why we have these physiological responses. And again, our posture changes. Our knees often will come inwards with that fear, which also, stops us from urinating too much. There's all these things that go together. All of our emotions are healthy in the right balance. That the physiological responses that if it's appropriate, that's exactly what we need. The problems we have with our emotions is when they're too excessive. If they're too extreme, it can cause harm within us, or when we
Mm-hmm.
get stuck in an emotional response and we hold on to it, and we literally then hold on to it in our body. We hold on to it in tensions around organs, around parts of our body, or increased levels of hormones and so on. We're literally holding that pattern when we don't need it anymore. And that then makes it hard for our body to just function normally. And also in terms of how we respond to the world around us, it's like we're still responding to something that happened ages ago. We now can no longer respond properly to what's happening right now.
Mm-hmm.
And so Qigong and Chinese medicine recognizes these connections and gives us practical ways that we can actually address them. And so we do exercises that, if we've got this tension around the kidneys, things that loosen and open that area. If our knees are coming inwards, we do exercises that open their back outwards so the posture changes, the tension around the organs change, the nerve activity changes, and that energy, that quite literally emotional energy that was stuck, is allowed to be released and move through, which then benefits us just physically and physiologically, but benefits our whole experience of life. It benefits our state of mind and so on. That was just one example with fear
Yeah.
and the kidneys. I could happily talk about others. So, if we have anger, often this is connected with cortisol release, and this then affects the tension in our body, the release of blood sugar from the liver. And so Chinese medicine recognizes this connection between the emotion of anger and the liver, and so on and so on. And it's like, it's fascinating, because so often we think of these as like just individual, physiological responses, and it's like they're not connected to anything. No, there's a reason why our body's doing that. And it comes through
Yeah.
in our physical well-being, but also in our subjective emotional experience as well. And Qigong ties this all together and gives us ways that we can release what's stuck and come back into balance and harmony.
Well, everything that you just mentioned is extremely interesting to think about. One of the things that I pull out of that, though, is thinking about the long-term implications, right? Because I've never
Mm-hmm.
really thought about it from that perspective, and that if you get stuck in one of these emotional states, then you are putting tension in places that tension doesn't belong. You can't release that. And to your point, it makes it very difficult to respond to the now when you're still responding to the then. And
Yeah.
so there are probably lots of things that develop physically from being in that I guess clenched position based on whatever that emotion was and what body parts it was affecting. That
Absolutely.
this would be phenomenal for people to be able to start to release that and at least to get closer to normal state.
Exactly. And that can be a bit of a process to begin with, because if you've held these patterns and you think about some of the emotions that sometimes people hold for all their lives, even,
Mm-hmm.
it can be a process to start to loosen and release that. So sometimes change can happen really, really fast, and that's awesome and amazing when it does. Other times, often it's more a gradual process that little by little you're able to let some of these things go. Then when you get to a state where things are at least reasonably balanced most of the time, and you've also now developed this ability to just be much more aware of yourself.
The
It's
awareness, yeah.
it's really interesting then, because then what you often get, because to begin with, people are often like, I'm feeling this emotion. Sometimes, and I don't really know why. I
Mm-hmm.
don't really know how it's affecting me. I just know I'm feeling this emotion. Once we manage to release a lot of that and we have this awareness, what will often happen is you'll notice things going on in your body, and this will then let you know, I'm experiencing this emotion. And I wouldn't have even noticed it if I wasn't aware of my body. Because for example, you'll notice like, I'm rounding my shoulders in. And you will know what that does to your organs and your energy flow. You're like, why am I rounding my shoulders in? You know what? I think I'm responding to this situation.
Yeah.
For a start, maybe I'd better open my shoulders, and maybe I should also think about how I'm interacting with this situation now. And so we can start to head
Right.
off situations before they get too bad, too extreme, too out of control. And it becomes about maintaining harmony rather than digging ourselves out of a hole of, whatever state we've found ourselves in.
Well, John, it feels like we are scratching the surface. And so my interest absolutely is piqued. So if people want to understand more, good gracious, where do they even start? Like
Yeah.
how do you suggest people start to try to explore and understand?
Sure. So on my website, we have a bunch of free resources, which is a good place for someone who's just curious, wanting to just start to figure out what this stuff's all about. So
Mm-hmm.
one of those is we have it's just a free course, and it's called Introduction to Qigong Theory and Practice, which is like, it's a pretty dry sort of a title, but within that, there's all this fascinating knowledge, right? Because in that course, it's both theory and practice. So it gives you a background understanding of lots of things about Qigong and how it works within the context of doing practices, so you can experience for yourself how they work. So you can experience how the mind and your body and your breath all work together to help you to become more aware of your energy. And so you start to go, okay, I get it. I get how this works.
Yeah.
And then as you start to tune into your energy, you can start to go, oh, I understand how by doing things like working with my breath, moving in different ways, I can actually start to move my energy and use it in healthy ways. So I think that's a really good place to just get an overall understanding of what this stuff is about and how it works. And then from there, there's lots of places that you can go in terms of, well, how deep do you want to get into it? Of course, there's lots of YouTube videos of practices you can follow along with, and that's not a bad place if you're just wanting to get a taste and feel of things. If you're wanting to go really deep, one of the main things that I do is I teach instructor certification courses. They're really in-depth courses, but if people really want to get into, understanding all the stuff about like how our organs relate to emotions and posture and meridians and all that sort of stuff, that's a fantastic training. And a lot of people do those just for their own interest. So some people do that kind of training because they're specifically wanting to teach. Other people, it's just, they just really want to dig in and understand things for themselves. Maybe somewhere in between, just following along with some videos and diving into a really in-depth course would be, we do certainly through my website, we do some live streaming practices where you can practice live with me from time to time, and often we'll talk about different things and things like that. So that can be another way as well. Or, maybe somewhat similar to that would be, of course, finding a Qigong instructor in your area. Now, different ways you can do that. You can do a Google search and just see what comes up. In terms of Long White Cloud Qigong instructors, so that's the name of my school, it's Long White Cloud Qigong. We also have a page on the website where you can click on find an instructor, and it's only grouped loosely by region around the world, but you never know, you could look through and find, hey, there's someone not too far from me, and there might be someone you might like to work with.
But there's hundreds of instructors around the world from your school, right?
Yeah, so overall we've got, I think it's over 450 instructors around the world.
Oh, wow.
So there's a fair few. They're not all on the website because not everyone wants to have their details published, but there's a fair few of them you can just find listed on the website. But yeah, so there's a few out there. I like to think that I've certainly been trying my hardest to do my bit to spread Qigong and make it accessible to more people.
That's incredible. Well, I got to thank you for spending the time with us today. I mean, I've actually learned a lot, and it's given me a lot to think about, and I certainly will be checking out the website. To your point, it used to be very difficult to do things remotely and learn without being physically present, but technology is great, and I think we've all changed our minds about the ability to do things on a remote basis, and so it makes it more convenient, and you get a lot out of it, and so I'm going to spend some time looking at that.
Yeah, great. That would be awesome. I'd love to hear what you think as you explore some of the practices and maybe what effects it has on you.
Absolutely. And I'll try to link all the things in the description of the episode so people can click around and follow what we talked about, particularly if they're driving or doing something else different today. And that way, hopefully people will get as much out of it as I did, and maybe they'll reach out and try to learn as well.
Cool.
So,
that would be great.
Thank you so much. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Great. Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
If you've made it this far, then I have to thank you for your time. I hope you've learned something new and enjoyed listening to the discussion as much as I enjoyed having it. I'd love to hear from you about the show because we're working really hard to bring you great content, and the feedback really helps us get better. If you like what you've heard or watched, for those of you who are streaming out on YouTube, then take a split second to give us a thumbs up or a like. It really helps other people like you find the show too. And no one likes to miss out on the good stuff. So go ahead and subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't have to wonder when or if there's a new episode. And until next time, stay remarkable.